All right, good morning. I'd like to call this meeting of the Citizens Advisory Committee for August to order, please. First item of business will be the introductions. So we'll go around the room here and do self-introductions, and then we'll do a roll call. Let's start over here with Christine.
Okay, I'm Christina Bosworth. I believe I'm a CAC since last October, so not quite a year. I was appointed by Commissioner Mariella Smith, and I live in Southeast Hillsborough County in Waimama.
Josh Frank, appointee, Hillsborough County School Board.
I'm Rick Fernandez, Vice Chair, the Hispanic at-large representative.
Bill Roberts, I was appointed by the Aviation Authority.
Johnny Wong, CPO staff and CAC liaison.
Ed Majewski, appointed by Thea.
Don Skelton. I've been here about 2 years now, appointed by the board.
All right. Online, do we have some attendees?
Yes, I'm Artie Fryer, appointed by and representing the Transportation Disadvantaged Coordinating Committee.
Morning, Artie, welcome. Anybody else?
Loretta Kirk, CFO.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear either one.
Miaza Morrison, appointed by Commissioner Cohen.
Thank you.
Loretta Kirk, CFO for HART.
And Carolyn Brown, appointed by Commissioner Gwen Myers.
Good. Well, thanks for joining us virtually. Anyone else? All right, and member just joined us. Pringle, good morning.
Good morning, Hoyt Prindle, appointed by Commissioner Kemp and 5 minutes late.
All right. Bill, I think that takes care of our roll call. We have 7 members present in the room. So that should give us a quorum, right, John?
Yes, that's right.
All right, so with a quorum, I'd like to ask for a motion to allow our virtual participants to participate in the meeting. Do I hear a motion?
So moved.
Ed Jersey moves.
Second.
Second, Christina Oswald second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right. Passes. Thank you.
There's one opposing vote, Mike.
There wasn't opposing vote. Good. All right, the first item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from June and July meetings of the CAC. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped over public comment. Is there anyone signed up for public comment? No one here in the room. Anyone virtually signed up?
Everybody virtually has the option to unmute themselves if they would like to speak.
Hearing no virtual comments, we'll close the public comment portion of the meeting, and now we'll go to the approval of the minutes for June and July. We can take them separately or we can take them together at the pleasure of the committee. Is there a motion to approve one or both sets of minutes?
All rooms approved vote.
Don Skelton moves approval of June and July's minutes of the committee. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Ed seconds it. Is there discussion on the approval of minutes? Rick Fernandez.
I don't have any comments on the July, but for June I do. I'm looking at page 7, of the minutes document, at least page 7 of the PDF document, I guess it is. It's where the motions are being discussed. Motion 1, Rick Fernandez moved. It's that paragraph. The first sentence of that paragraph is, well, it's just very difficult to understand. It's not actually the way it played out on the tape. So what I'm going to offer is the actual reading of the motion, which is pretty close to what's there, but not quite. Rick Fernandez moved that the record of this CAC meeting incorporate the action or the actions of the March 2, 2022 motion to strike and report out to the TPO board that we have recommended striking FPN numbers, and the FPN numbers are correct. It was seconded, according to this, by Don Skelton, although as I reviewed the tape, I couldn't tell who the second was, and it wasn't referenced. Don, do you remember?
I don't.
Okay, I'm not sure that that's correct. Someone did second it. It's a disembodied spirit on the tape, and unfortunately, the name wasn't identified. The roll call vote was correct, a 5-5 tie. But I do want the minutes to read, to note that the chair restated the motion as a motion to strike those 2 line items from the tip.
Gail, have you got that correction?
Yes, Chair, I do.
All right, thank you. Any other comments or corrections on the minutes of June or July meeting? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Anyone online opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. The minutes of June and July are approved as amended. Thank you. So the next item on our agenda is our action items. Thank you all for being here in person. We do have a forum, so we can take these action items up. And the first will be a freight supply chain resilience study. Jason of AECOM. Jason, you ready?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. You may go ahead.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. Just one moment.
Okay.
Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Well, I'm very happy to be here with you all this morning. My name is Jason Smeek. I work with AECOM, and I am AVP of Global Supply Chain and Logistics. And I want to bring to you today the presentation of the Freight Supply Chain Resilience Study, which we have been conducting over the past few months together with the TPO. So the study objectives, we really were looking at this topic really as a first look into the supply chains of Hillsborough County and the Tampa region, especially since we've learned and seen a lot of the impacts through the COVID experience and the pandemic, the impacts to our supply chains, and everybody's felt, at least in some way, impacts of supply and demand mismatch, transportation disruption, and things like that. It became very clear there was an opportunity to study this issue a little bit further in detail and to develop recommendations that could be carried forward. During this study, we mapped the supply chains of 5 different commodities and services. Those commodities and services I'll go through in a short bit. Identified potential supply chain vulnerabilities due to disruptions, and then recommended actions associated with our observations. Those included actions that mitigate impacts, that strengthen supply chains, strengthen transportation networks and mobility. Establish ongoing engagement is an important piece of this to ensure that we have key supply chain partners, both public and private, and communities engaged in the process of making the supply chain more resilient and the freight network more resilient. And also looking at infrastructure and policies and programs outside of the transportation sphere that increase overall resiliency and sustainability and equity within the region that can enable a stronger community, a stronger network even before those disasters or disruptions might occur, so that when those do occur, we are more resilient. Those recommendations then were categorized and set a TPO role of leader, collaborator, facilitator And the intent is to utilize this as a guide for further action in the future. So really briefly, our timeline, we started in February of this year, looking at defining the commodities and services as well as the disaster scenarios that would be in the study. We utilized a long list of potential hazards and disasters disruptions from other hazard mitigation work, other hazard mitigation plans, the FEMA guidelines that exist around hazard planning and mitigation, as well as the supply chain resiliency guide, and took those and distilled those down to what we believed were the most important to study as a first look for Hillsborough County. Task 2, we did a commodity flow analysis and supply chain resiliency analysis. Really what that meant is taking data sets and then analyzing the data to define what nodes in the supply chain exist, and then how much information we could gather from that data set, publicly available data, that indicated what the modal split was between rail, between trucking, between pipeline as an example, and then also the percent of import versus export in region, and then the finally the main list of employers and companies that are within each of those nodes within each of the commodities. So I'll show you that in a few minutes. During this time, we also did a number of stakeholder small group interviews in April. Those were intended to give us some insights, some initial insights into what people were seeing, as well as opportunities to incorporate community input. And that information then helped to inform and vet the commodity service disaster scenario selection task that had completed previous to that. And then stakeholder one-on-one interviews then commenced. We did a number of stakeholder one-on-one interviews. Those were intended to dive a little bit deeper and also give some clarity as to what we were hearing as far as observations and impacts of those on the supply chain. And we're currently in task 3 and actually wrapping that up. Supply chain resiliency recommendations is really this focus, as well as providing some insight into and foreshadowing to the report that will be ready by the end of this month, today in this presentation, among others. Sorry. So I'll tell you about the study framework. We really utilize a number of different sources and data sets and models for this effort to give a really comprehensive view of inputs and effects of disasters and disruptions. We utilized literature and case study review for a lot of inputs, especially at the beginning of the project, looking at what was very much in the news as far as supply chain impacts and supply chain journals around cyber, around a number of other critical impacts such as transportation incidents, and also we're sure to incorporate what's already been developed both in Hillsborough County and also by FEMA around guidelines, hazard mitigation planning, et cetera, to inform our study. We also use data, the HAZUS models and Phoenix models around sea level rise, storm impact, that gave us a sense of where certain areas within the county would be impacted in certain types of rain and wind events, as an example, or tropical systems. And then very importantly, we had a lot of stakeholder and community input. And in fact, this constituted a very significant portion of our project, really taking into account those small group interviews, community sessions, and individual stakeholder interviews, where we facilitated a dialogue and had an open discussion around where we saw potential opportunities for improvement, as well as where we really felt impacts during disasters and disruptions in the past. The 5 commodities that we studied were food and grocery, water and wastewater utility, housing material, such as lumber, plywood, roofing material, healthcare services and medicine, and fuel and distribution systems. And these were chosen, as I mentioned, because of their impact to overall lifelines and well-being within our communities, but also really because they are some of those elemental lifeline elements that need to be present to withstand and recover from a disaster or disruption. And as a first look by Hillsborough County into the supply chain specific aspects of disruptions and disasters, this really made a lot of sense to start kind of at this base level of what would absolutely be required for well-being during one of these events. So I mentioned supply chain maps. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but 5 of these were created, 1 for each of the disasters and disruptions that I mentioned previously. And you can see here kind of as a general overview, it's really a flow of the inputs, the different connectivity that exists between different nodes within the supply chain. For example, information flow, financial flow, knowledge flow, as well as, of course, the material flows that occur. And what this is intended to do, and what it did for us during our study, is really identified where the inputs came into the process, what different stages things go through. For example, from the input phase into agricultural supplier phase for this food and grocery, to production, to processing, to wholesaling, to the overall retail, and then frankly goes even further into consumption and waste, and then of course starts the process over. What's important also is to note that we designated what knowledge supply chain partners, financial supply chain partners, and other supply chain partners or enablers were required for a properly functioning supply chain, and then took the data sets to identify what modal split existed. For example, the split between truck versus water versus rail versus air, or in some cases pipeline in water and fuel. And then looked at also the sum of purchases that are available via FAF and BTS to identify what that general split is of in Tampa versus outside of Tampa purchases. That gives us a sense, at least directionally, of how much is being produced, let's say, within a certain node, or how much is being brought in from outside. And then finally, we utilized another data set to identify the top 10 companies. These are companies, or even in some cases agencies, as far as supply, that we can then coordinate and collaborate with going forward in the future. Those are the key ones as far as purchase data that give us a sense of the scale and also their impact to the supply chain. So as I mentioned, these maps then were utilized as an input into the study and helped us identify where potential breakdowns could occur based on the case studies, the input from the team, etc. The disaster scenarios that were selected and were studied were 3: cyber attack, transportation incident, as well as flooding and wind events. What's important here to note is that we often focus very heavily on hurricane events as far as planning and hazard mitigation. However, very clearly there have been a number of events, especially current state in the world, that cyber attack has become a major problem for supply chains and was chosen for study, as well as transportation incidents. And what's interesting about cyber attack as an example, many of the key elements of our electric network, as an example, are controlled by SCADA systems, or supervisory control and data acquisition systems. And those are, in some cases, they are exposed, I guess, for cyber attacks. So given the situation in Ukraine, what we're seeing globally as far as ransomware and other impacts, we thought that was a very applicable one to study in the realm of supply chain management. The other one that was different from a hurricane or tropical system event is a transportation incident. And we thought that this was also very important given the impacts, whether purposeful or not, of key critical infrastructure going down, as an example. We studied these as well as combination events, cyber attack with flooding wind event, as well as transportation incident, to give a sense of what might happen in the case of 2 events occurring at the same time. COVID was a good example of where many events occurred at the same time during that duration of the pandemic, and we thought it would be important to see what the impacts are of maybe compounded events. And I will mention that climate change obviously is a key point that we studied during this, looking at the different inundation events that could occur, as well as what sea level rise does in this instance, and frankly, the impacts of climate change to communities and their ability to be resilient during these disasters and disruptions as well. So certainly, stakeholder and community outreach was critical for us. We did 6 group interviews. Those group interviews focused on groups that represented resilience, transportation, communications, utilities, economic and land use, emergency management, and medical, as well as freight, and had 2 community sessions. One session with the corporation to develop communities at Tampa, as well as the University Area Community Development Corporation. In addition to that, stakeholder interviews were conducted. Those one-on-one interviews focused on, for example, the Aviation Authority, the Port, Tampa Bay. We talked with the Florida Highway Patrol, as well as tried to incorporate a number of private companies as well. And we have a couple more to complete during the remainder of this study. So some of the things that we heard from stakeholders and community outreach, the input that we heard, especially from those community sessions, were that during COVID and also during other events in the past, we had a lot of supply chain disruptions and challenges that occurred that had cascading effects throughout the supply chain. We talked about price inflation, obviously a topic of discussion today, given the state of the economy, in gas and in food, right? And what that does to workforce as well as to mobility in these events. Panic buying and shortages, we saw that during COVID with people buying because they thought they would lose access to certain products, and what that does to availability. Reduced store hours and pharmacy hours, mainly due to workforce considerations. And I won't go through all of these, but what they indicate to us is that the proper functioning of a supply chain is much greater than just the transportation network or just the utilities that are provided. It's a holistic picture that needs to be considered that covers other enablers, which I'll go through in a moment. One of the other key things that we saw during these disruptions were lack of certain things, right? So we teased out during many of our sessions what inputs are required for the proper functioning of these different commodities and services. For example, we all know that power is a critical piece to this, as well as backup power, and certainly some other, really, specific components such as sterilization chemicals for water and treatment and medical use were in short supply during COVID. It's a good example of where maybe one little piece of the chain might be broken that then impacts and cascades throughout the entire supply chain. What we learned was that redundancy is key, as we all would imagine, but also that being able to supply different resource substitutions, or even in the case of processes within companies, looking beyond our current automated kind of world and very IT-centric world to physical process backup is important as well, and ensuring that people are trained and staffed to service those companies that are within the supply chain or those agencies to ensure that the supply continues during one of these events. And that's really, really important when we think about the enablers that allow us to do so. Quickly here, disaster scenarios, we talked through those. We use resources such as research of literature and case studies, especially different sources from supply chain journals and other supply chain publications, especially around these where established models, let's say, are less refined as they are for flooding and wind and rain events. For that, we used the Project Phoenix model as well as the HAZUS model, and incorporated climate change impacts to that, and then looked at these commodities supply chains and did a number of observations of impact, of implications, of severity, as well as actionable recommendations that came thereafter. And what I mentioned previously around these enablers, really these are the supporting elements that help a supply chain function, such as workforce or utilities. Obviously, the transportation network is critical, but those vulnerable populations and neighborhoods are also a large portion of this to ensure that we have strength in all of these different enablers to help with overall resiliency. Financial flows, communications, and other supply chain partners, as was mentioned previously, these round out what those enablers look like. So what are some of the outcomes? Well, we obviously saw there's a link between climate change as well as between ESG efforts and supply chain resilience. And so the big takeaway here is that if the society is overall more equitable, resilient, and sustainable in normal circumstances, it will be more resilient under emergency circumstances. So we found that disaster and disruption impacts certainly tease out and expose where we have issues in that area. And this is really important for our communities, especially vulnerable communities, to realize that the more that we can do to ensure that we are a stronger community, we have a stronger transportation network, we have stronger utilities, et cetera, the better we will be to able to withstand some of those disasters and disruptions. Other hazards should be studied, not just hurricanes in this case. So we want to ensure that people understand that there are other hazards that should be planned for. And frankly, we should be going through efforts to tabletop exercise as one recommendation, a supply chain oriented disaster disruption such as cyber attack, to see what the impacts are of those type of events to the supply chain, and plan just as we would for other hazards in the county. Approximately 80 actionable recommendations came out of this, and most are transportation related, frankly, but others are workforce or enabler related or pertain to overall resiliency. So this gives you a sense of what those categorizations look like by both TPO, role, and type, as well as the breakdown of study guide and research, transportation, grant opportunity, training, tool, and education related, as well as coordination. So I'm going to go into a number of recommendations to close out our presentation. These are just a few of those 80, and I specifically chose the transportation related ones for us today, but importantly, there are a number of other recommendations at the end that I'll talk to around some other study and research or engagement, whether it be community collaboration or public and private entity collaboration, that are really important to make the recommendations actionable and enable us to continue to improve in this area. So this is an example of looking at transportation, and you can see here we looked at rain events as well as 10-year and 25-year inundation events, and what those look like to the broader area using models and GIS tools. And we hone in here on Hooker's Point as an example. And one of the key observations here is that a lot of the critical industry here, including the wastewater treatment plant, are serviced by rail, but there's one spur basically that services this entire point. So one of the ideas is to study and identify the improvements that could improve the resilience of road and rail infrastructure, providing access to and from Hooker's Point as one example. Another example is looking at opportunities to improve access to critical infrastructure within the county. For example, our airport networks have, we're blessed with a number of airports in the Tampa area. But certainly access to these, especially during cases of emergency, are very important. And it was highlighted during one of our discussions that the Tampa Executive Airport, as one example, really has some opportunity to improve access here. It really only has one major way of getting to and from the airport. Another example is looking at truck-specific infrastructure and policies within the region. Obviously, we look at here at 75 as an example, right? The critical junctions, as well as north-south routes within the county that really link this county and its freight movement to the critical I-4 corridor, as well as the port infrastructure and other infrastructure in the region. And so we thought that it might be important to look at designated truck lanes as an example on the interstate system. Direct ramp connections have been employed as, for example, in the Port of Long Beach in LA and other ports to ensure that there's easy access and frankly efficient access for truckers from and to ports within the region. Temporal separation of freight traffic through the use of managed lanes or intelligent transportation systems automated and connected vehicle technology, and other ways to improve the access and redundancy of the freight network. Here's an example of one around the Ybor Channel. Certainly we've seen a growth in the cruise industry, and what we wanted to do here was conduct a complete street and freight access resilience study for this area. You can see that there are many areas, especially on the east side, that are impacted by sea level rise, and there's a lot of traffic that occurs here. And so access to Hooker's Point, as well as movement overall of freight in this area, especially during peak cruise activity time periods, would be worth looking at. Also looking at freight specific improvements such as truck aprons, mountable infrastructure, stormwater facilities that could be improved, activated stormwater infrastructure, and the like. And this also helps with surrounding community strength as well, especially susceptible neighborhoods, and making this more a pedestrian focused area. Looking at identifying improvements to Falkenberg Road between State Route 60 and 574, and preserving access to Hillsborough County facilities. One of the things that we saw pretty clearly, especially in the case of compound events or transportation related events, was that in the case of sea level rise and one of those occurring, you would have really the area here cut off from a number of different transportation routes. So considering the access to this area, especially the criticality of it to PSOC, as well as county-owned warehouses that are critical to disaster response, and the sheriff's facility during these events is really important, it would be worth looking at this area further. Another one is looking at the resilience of Commerce Street and Port Tampa Drive in Port Tampa City, west of Inner Bay Boulevard, and preserving the access to port area facilities during these 10 and 25-year inundation events within the next 20 years. Some examples could include raised roadway profiles in the area, enhanced stormwater facilities, and strengthened and enlarged bridge culvert structures, etc. And this is really important because of the activity that occurs down here, as well as access to the southern tip of this McDill. Another example is really the overall resilience of the CSX Port Tampa Spur rail line and the ability to access this area. Looks like certainly in this part, right, we're in a good shape, but certainly as you get closer to this and you start considering the impacts of sea level rise, we start to see that a lot of this would be inundated during some of those events. Again, similar recommendations for what we could look at. The resilience of US 41 is really important between Big Bend Road and State Route 60 to preserve access to the port area facilities here along the east side. Really, this is very clear that there's sea level rise as well as major roadway implications over kind of the 25-year period. And so we'd want to study this and look at this opportunity to improve movement here during those events, as well as overall resiliency. Similarly here, between Big Bend Road and CSX, the UCD yard, preserving access to port facilities is also very important. Similar recommendation. And overall, right, those are some of the examples of what transportation specific recommendations look like. But as mentioned, other recommendations such as incorporating supply chain resilience into the overall TPO long range transportation plan, or developing local supply chain resilience best practices guides that can be shared via social media or distributed to local businesses, could be a great way to improve resiliency. Coordination is probably one of the biggest outcomes of this. What we really would like to see is Hillsborough County develop methods to work even further with public and private collaboration, specifically because we have a great portion of the supply chain, right, is really run by these private companies, or those that are really not state or federal or locally controlled. And so it's important that we have the interface, that connectivity, that knowledge of other supply chain connections, best practices, as well as people in the event of one of these disasters, disruptions, that we could reach out to at these companies to collaborate with. So Establishing a TPO freight advisory committee is one recommendation where you could get these actors together, maybe considering those top companies within each of these key commodities and bring them on as part of that advisory committee, as well as establishing more supply chain focused tabletop or functional practice exercises around cyber or other events. Creating tool sets, creating training, educational opportunity for managers in critical retail distribution positions, and really looking at this from a GIS-based situation would be a great improvement on the study. We looked at those elements from a general perspective, incorporating the sea level rise as well as HAZUS and Phoenix models, and looked at the overall road network and density and congestion areas, but mapping these private companies that are critical to the flow of these commodities would be a great second step here in the process of making things more resilient and learning more about the supply chain. And then looking at what we can incorporate from a IIJA and infrastructure law grant around whether it be alternative fuel corridors or improving overall resilience of the supply chain. There's more than ever before a focus on supply chain performance, on freight planning incorporated into transportation planning, and incorporating those elements of resiliency and of ESG into the plans related to freight than ever before. So there's opportunity from that to look at grant funding, as well as maybe establishing small business grant programs for supply chain resilience within the region. Next steps, we're going to be completing our one-on-one interviews with our key agency and private stakeholders over the next week or two. We have a couple next week as well to focus on completing that out and incorporating other recommendations as is possible. And then finalizing the study the end of this month to be then publicly available for consumption. Okay, that's all I have. Any questions?
We have a number of questions. We'll start with Christina.
Yes, thank you, Christina Bosworth. Jason, you mentioned in your presentation that you had 80 recommendations.
Yes.
And obviously you didn't list all 80 here, but did you rank those or do you plan to rank them? And if so, what methodology did you use? I mean, did you look at what's critical or versus maybe some low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, so what we did was we categorized them, and within each category, we looked at what had an impact to all of the supply chains, the commodities and services specifically, as well as what had an impact to all, let's say, of the disasters and disruptions that could be mitigated through the use of that recommendation. And so we categorized those at the front that had the broadest impact to both supply chain as well as the resiliency during one of these disasters or disruptions, or in the combination thereof. And then from there went from what we would perceive as the most critical within each of those disaster disruptions thereafter. So we did prioritize them. I think that probably the lowest hanging fruit, so to speak, of all of these is really to start the collaboration efforts, incorporating maybe, let's say, this freight advisory committee to bring together public and private and ensure that we start to collaborate more on these supply chain related resiliency topics, since we do already a lot of work around hazard response and mitigation.
Jason, may I add quick though? We also looked at the TPO's role. So anything that they could potentially lead, those kind of got a higher, I guess, priority versus if they need to collaborate with other stakeholders or, facilitate connections between public and private partners. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so that's correct, Lauren. We really did prioritize as well as make visible those elements that we thought that TPO could potentially lead, and gave the role of, whether it be leader or collaborator, or facilitator, et cetera, that's so that it could be more actionable for TPO as well.
Could I ask if the second presenter would identify herself just for the record?
I apologize. This is Lauren Brooks with AECOM. I'm the project manager for this study.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Josh Frank's right.
Thank you. I'm going to try and summarize what I have in terms of my thoughts and concerns into as brief as I can. I was expecting to be so motivated by freight this morning. So I have one really big concern, and I think this study is really lacking in context. Context in a lot of ways. One being, for example, the slow-moving disaster we are living through every day in terms of bike and ped crashes and fatalities. I see a list of recommendations that are transportation related. You say, I say they're truck related and truck oriented. For example, I've got the eBoard channel slide up on my computer right now, and every recommended improvement involves things that make our pedestrian realm worse rather than better. And so, understanding the context of, essentially the larger situation that we're in as a region, both in terms of our already stated goals for Vision Zero to some of the other resilience related initiatives. I know, for example, there's this sort of 3 R's, reinforce, rebuild, retreat. I think there's a lack of considering the retreat in a lot of these recommendations where, for example, continuing on Palmetto Beach, that's a neighborhood. And it's a neighborhood that is below the poverty level in a lot of places. And so folks, car ownership is lower, they have to walk to work. And so to double down or triple down on really hard infrastructure that really only incentivizes more truck traffic, makes more curb cuts, more mountable curbs, for example. It makes the area more dangerous, I think is incredibly short-sighted. And I think it's a result of what it seems to be a pretty siloed approach in how you're engaging stakeholders. I don't know what the UACDC folks have to say about coastal areas. They're pretty far from the coast, frankly. And so for a lot of these slides, I don't know how much engagement you've actually made to the neighborhoods that are adjacent to some of these freight infrastructure and the port and Port Tampa, but it doesn't look like a lot. And I think that's a big, big problem. The last thing I want to say is, I appreciate the recommendations. I do think that, having resiliency means the ability to bounce back after a disaster. And, but I think the means and methods listed here are way, way, way lower priority than perhaps, fixing the day-to-day impacts of folks that don't have sidewalks in their neighborhoods or don't have street lights. And so, I'm not saying that these aren't important things to look at. I think that the lens with which they have been looked at in this study are completely off base. So I think that summarizes as much as I've got, but I appreciate the presentation nonetheless.
Thank you, Josh. Rick Fernandez.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to bury the lead, so just to be perfectly honest with the presenters and anybody else who cares, I will not be voting on this positively. But I am curious about a couple of things. First of all, assume, forget for a moment what we may or may not do and whether the board even gives a damn. But assume for the moment that you make this presentation to the board next week and they approve it. What happens next? What's the next step in terms of your activities?
Mr. Fernandez, this is Allison Yang. We are actually making a presentation to the board in September when we finalize the report. As Jason mentioned, we have a few more stakeholder interviews, one-on-one to conduct, and we're finalizing. We're coming to this board to.
We're not getting any of that audio. There's either
Can you not hear me?
Or a bad connection.
Is she not in the building?
Allison.
I'm not in the building.
Allison, all we hear is static.
Was that Allison? Allison, we cannot understand anything. So
I can chime in and attempt to answer. I think if this were presented to the board, depending on
which way they vote this. If they approve it, we would probably explore internally which of the recommendations to pursue. Some of these were pretty grand in scale, as in considering resiliency in the next LRTP. We're already thinking through how we might incorporate that, possibly as a needs assessment. And many of the other low-hanging fruit for recommendations that could be accomplished easily were just coordination with stakeholders. So I think that would probably be the first step.
Okay. Couple more questions, Chair.
Okay.
To the presenters, if you know, what was the cost of the study to date?
This is Lauren Brooks. It was a little less than $80,000.
And if I understand correctly, you're not done yet.
We are nearing completion. We will have the final document completed by the end of August, by the end of this month.
Okay. My next comment, question, define it as you will, I guess it's a procedural. I'm just curious, as a member of this committee, why it is that this is being presented to us as an action item as opposed to a status report or informational item. What are we being asked to do here?
Are you able to hear me now?
Either Jason can answer or John Paul might. You want to take a stab at it?
I'd like to take a shot at it because I think it's more TPO administrative.
Okay.
So I think that we were considering bringing this before the CAC some months back, but we had some full agendas with the tip and workshop. We knew that would take up a lot of time. Rather than presenting it as a status report, we are bringing it for an action item to you today. And I think that the proposed action would be to recommend approval of the board. When they see the presentation, they'll have questions, of course, and even if they approve it the September meeting, there will still be an opportunity to make changes to it.
So this, I understood through the static, this is not to be presented to the board next week. It's going to be presented to the board.
I don't have the agenda in front of me. I think I heard Allison say September. Allison, can you correct me if that's wrong?
That's correct.
That is correct.
So typically, there will be some contingency funds or rollover funds in the contract left over for making any amendments or changes requested by the board. There's still time to incorporate any of the recommendations coming from this committee or from.
So that I'm clear, just to bring this in for a landing. As an individual member of this committee, I am being asked through my vote to endorse the recommendations of this study today that will be presented in September to the board. A study that is not yet complete, but will be presented in 2 months to the board. Okay, I got it. All right, thank you. That's it.
Excuse me, Chair.
Yes. Go ahead.
Allison has responded in chat, and I'd be happy to read her response if you'd like.
Yes, please.
She says that they'll be presenting this to the board in September, that depending on how they approve it will depend on how it's moved forward with the recommendations. And they're requesting acceptance of the recommendations only. The study will be presented in final in September. Allison, did I get that correct? You can just nod. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Allison. All right, other questions? Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I assume you're aware that DOT, Florida DOT District, has had a very active freight program for at least 10 years or more. And I would question the MPO creating a freight advisory committee because there's already a regional freight advisory committee. And when you get down to it, supply chain issues tend to be very regional. And especially when you're trying to get private sector people like truck company people to participate in things, they're not you know, they're not like government employees that get paid to go to meetings. You know, their business is being chargeable, doing productive things. And so I would suggest not duplicating what's already a very strong regional freight advisory committee with an MPO advisory committee. I just think you're going to be very difficult. I'd also like to mention, you know, Josh, trucks are part of transportation. And surely we need to be concerned and aware of impacts on pedestrians and bicycles and everything. I will say that DOT has also prepared a very excellent design guideline on incorporating freight into complete streets. And I would just urge the MPO to be pretty plugged into some pretty good products that I think I've seen DOT produce related to freight activity.
Good points. Any other questions?
If I may, I don't see any of that in this report. That's my point, is I know that that information exists, but every recommendation that's listed in this presentation we have is not anywhere near the level of some of the standards that DOT has created and some of the standards that this county has established for itself in terms of Vision Zero. For example, adding lanes to I-4 and I-75 only, as I've stated before, incentivizes more trips on those corridors because of induced demand. I think that's incongruent with the Vision Zero goals that have been stated by this county. And, you know, again, if this were a more holistic presentation and had more of that considered, you know, I would consider, you know, approving this. Right now, I just don't see it. I'm looking again at the Palmetto slide just to keep on that example, because this area is pretty near and dear to my heart. But I don't know what determinant is made that says that this is a freight-oriented area rather than a neighborhood first. And for me, that is a major red flag. So that's all. Ed, I know we're not going to come to agreement on this, so we don't need to berate it and go back and forth. But that's just how I see it.
All right, thank you, Josh. Are there comments or questions from any of our committee members online? Gail, are there any hands raised? Yeah, Johnny Wong has a question.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for that presentation. I'm curious what the reaction was from chambers of commerce or maybe industrial recruitment offices that might play a role in recruiting manufacturing or distribution companies to the area. Like, are they aware of the regional risk profile when they're trying to attract industry here? Are they focusing on those types of necessary aspects of the supply chain?
So your question as to the companies that are relocating or potentially choosing the Hillsborough area, or what is, sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah,
choosing. Well, I think that, you know, certainly because of the awareness of risk and supply chain risk management that as a field has really come into its own over the last 10 years in the industry that we talk about. You know, all the companies that are site selecting are considering hazards in their planning and site selection. It is a critical piece of the puzzle as far as site selection is concerned today. It was less so in the past. I think what's happening now, though, is being more holistic in the approach to understanding not only what the hazard is, but also how resilient the infrastructure surrounding it is, as well as the additional redundancy that could occur in the region. So it's a more broader picture than that, just understanding, okay, well, I'm in a hazard prone area, let's say. It's also understanding what the mitigation elements are and how prepared the community is that makes it an attractive place to site. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Any other questions of the committee? Anyone online have a question? One more time. Jason and Laura, thank you for making the presentation. This is an action item for our committee. So this time I'll entertain a motion to approve or disapprove the recommendations contained in this report and pass them on to the TPO board.
I'll move to approve it.
And Majerski moves approval. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Don Skelton seconds. Is there any further discussion? Anyone online care to comment? Hearing none, I'll ask for a roll call vote. Gail, if you would call the roll of attendees, please.
Bill Roberts,
No?
Rick Fernandez,
No.
Carolyn Brown. Carolyn,
No.
thank you.
Sorry, what was that?
That was Carolyn. She voted no. Hoyt Prindle,
No.
Christina Bosworth,
No.
Miaza Morrison, Miaza, you are self-muted.
Oh, sorry, I hear you now. No.
Artie Fryer,
No.
Don Skelton,
No.
Ed Mrzyuski,
I'll vote no too. I wanted to make it a motion to have a vote, but I'll vote no.
Okay, thank you.
Josh Frank,
No.
and the motion fails. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10-0.
Did you call Hart Pringle's name?
I said no.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
He did. I did, and yes, he did say no.
Okay, all right. Motion does not pass.
I do have one more thing in chat, and it's from Allison, and she says if the committee wishes, you can delay the recommendation until September.
I think that would be appropriate, and I would be certainly willing to put it back on our agenda for the September 7th meeting.
Point of order.
Mr. Fernandez.
I'll be clear as to what that means. We just took action on the motion. That's action of the committee. So is the question from Allison simply that we delay the report to the board until September, or that we revisit the action as a committee in September?
Fair question.
I will wait for her reply.
And not to preempt Allison.
To revisit the action in September.
Then
Why would we do that?
no. Why would we do that other than you didn't like the result just now?
Unless they make changes we recommend.
Well, I took the recommendation from Allison that we would hear this item again in September, but we would report to the board this month, this action taken today. And if the report gets better and we like it, we can take action on it in September. I think that's the intent.
And she has replied that they will take into consideration your comments and provide the final report in September.
Mr. Fernandez.
Well, we took action just now. If you need a motion, I'll do another motion, but I think the action of the committee taken 5 minutes ago should be reported to the board next week at their board meeting. Whatever happens in September, happens in September. But no, I'm not willing to just delay this for another month.
I think you didn't hear what I said. What I said is that I will report the action taken today to the TPO board at their next meeting.
Okay.
Our committee report. And we will bring it back as an item in our September meeting, see if the committee wishes to change their position.
Okay. Well, I understood what you said. I heard what she said. They seemed inconsistent. That's fine. I'll just listen to the meeting next week and see what gets reported and go from there.
Sure you will. All right. Well, thank you, Jason and Lauren, for the presentation. We'll move on to our next action item, which is going to be Davita Franklin. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I am Davita Franklin with the TPO, and today I'm presenting, with some assistance, proposed amendments to the public participation plan. Okay, we're just navigating the screen here. And they'll just be.
Who are we looking at on the screen?
That's the CFO.
Who should,
Loretta Kerr, our CFO.
that's Loretta Kirk, that picture?
Yep.
Those online, bear with us for getting the presentation queued up.
Right. Okay,
All right.
Michael, our support person here. All right, so I'm coming to you to present proposed amendments for the public participation plan. And just to give you some background, this is basically the document that guides how the TPO engages the public and practices that we put in place to make it efficient and very valuable for them to engage with us. So a few months ago, I did come to you with the measures of effectiveness report. This report, the public participation plan, is updated every 2 years. I presented to you the measures of effectiveness report, which compiles data over 2 years to see how we can do a better job. And this committee did approve that report upon the condition that it would be amended to include more accurate and thorough information about the transportation improvement program hearing and the decisions and the public input that was that took place this year. So you helped make it a better report. And now here's a follow-up or connected report to that, which is how we're going to take that information and engage the public, and again, make it quite valuable for them to just be able to glean all that we can give them in terms of interacting with us and our plans and our studies, and just making it a better culture of engagement. So here's an example that I'm giving you that will basically break down in a more simple way the amendments, but there are 2 amendments that we're looking at today. So they involve the notice that we give to the public for how long they have to review a transportation improvement program or TIP amendments. And then also, what are we going to do to make sure that, again, they're able to just engage with us as much as we think we can to make sure that they understand what's coming before them and how they can have a say in TIP amendments. So you have here the results of a pilot that we did this past year. So prior to this amendment on how we engage the public, all we did was put TIP amendments on our website, and that was it. We didn't put out any social media posts or any road signs or anything like that. So for a year, we decided, hey, what can we do to really make sure that the public's aware of TIP amendments and also how they can give us some feedback? So on the left side, you have a social media post that would go out with every TIP amendment this past year. This particular one is for the West River District Build Grant Project. And then on the right side, we have road signs that also went up for that project. We still put the amendment on our website as a dedicated web page. And we also put out a press release. And so we'll either put out a press release, we would have either put out a press release or a newsletter article for TIP amendments for this past year. So this is now what we would like to formalize and put into the public participation plan, that with every TIP amendment, we are putting out a social media post, a road sign, a dedicated web page, and there's one more, so let me go down here and see, and a press release or newsletter article. And we actually have a 5th one that I'll tell you about in a moment. So again, the idea is let's put more out there. Now, the other side of that, which is the other amendment, is currently the plan says that we have to give the public 21 days notice for TIP amendments. In the real world, it doesn't really work out like that because of the way that our committees are scheduled, which is not the TPO's doing. It has something to do with CC meetings or Board of County Commissioners meetings and how those are scheduled, which then in turn will show us where we can put our scheduling down for our board meetings, which again, then you have your CAC meetings. So plan needs to be amended to accurately reflect that we have about 2 weeks when TIP amendments come up for us to allow the public to review them. it's also beneficial to make sure that we have that time frame, because when the Florida Department of Transportation, or FDOT, brings forth some valuable funding that we could possibly recommend for projects, then usually it's a small time frame that we're working with. So this is the picture here, which is you have two amendments. One which says, hey, we're going to do a whole bunch of engagement with the public to make sure that they're engaging when TIP amendments come up, that they're engaging us, we're getting feedback, and also being able to fully understand the impact of these amendments. And then two, that the window of opportunity for them to do that will decrease from 21 to 14. Now, I do have good news, which is when we did that this past year, we had over 24 responses from the public on TIP amendments. In previous years, we had none. So when I put on my marketing hat, I think about, well, how can we make sure that this 2-week time frame is going to work? Well, in marketing, what you find out is that most people actually look at stuff and consider it within 2 weeks of an event or whatever it might be that they're trying to look at. And with our feedback that we got, most of the people actually engaged us within the 5 days before the TIP amendment was any TIP amendment was being considered. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. So basically, what I'm asking you today, and then I'll go through the next slides, which will show the actual verbiage that's changing, that you consider that we've done a good job of making sure that the public is aware of TIP amendments within 2 weeks, that we can commit to doing that very effectively. And these are the ways that I brought forth that we're going to do it. So again, if approved. So here's the actual verbiage that's changing. So there you see it says TIP amendments. There's a minimum review period of 21 days. We would like to change that to 14. Also here again, it talks about the again, a proposed 14-day review period. And this here says now the second piece, which is what we would do, which is put a social media post in place. Just so you know, those posts are targeted. So we have used zip codes in the vicinities of the projects that are related to the different TIP amendments that we had last year. And again, we were able to get some great feedback from that. A notice on our website with a dedicated web page, post, and news media websites. That's a new one that actually came through from meeting with the different committees. So one of the things, I'm sorry, that came from a public respondent on the PPP. So he said, hey, can you put out some stuff on some news media websites? So now I'm on TampaBay.com and TBT. We'll make sure that we put not just TIP amendments on there, but actually our meetings to try to, again, engage the public in a better fashion. Also, press releases or newsletter article and newsletter articles, and then also placing the road signs. And I'm happy to announce that again, from bringing this to committees, we also then had a committee member who said, hey, what about people who may not look at all this stuff? So we're actually going to do mailers out to, on the TIP amendments, to projects which require right-of-way acquisition. So again, this stuff is just getting better as we're bringing this information over to you. And then here again, it talks about, in this verbiage here, 2 weeks. And then this again just gives you the snapshot of what's going to change in there, which we're going to put in there everything that I just said that we're going to do. So the recommended action is for you to approve the public participation plan amendments. And again, I've been able to try it. It's a great way for us to reach the public and also to stay true to the timeframes that we're actually able to provide in terms of the review period. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm definitely for it.
Thank you, David. Questions from the committee? Ed, starting with you.
Yeah, I like what you're doing. Only when I think about this from a logical point of view, it makes me think, if you're going to post road signs for an amendment, like, does that mean you should be posting road signs for every project in the TIP, which of course seems like that would be a gargantuan impossibility, but it seems like you're applying a different logic to the amendment that is totally inapplicable to, the dozens and dozens of projects that are in the TIP.
So for the TIP, they actually did post road signs. They weren't for all of the projects, because like you said, it's massive. But for the ones that Johnny may have to.
Of the new projects that were submitted to us, I think we ended up with 60
Yes.
road signs countywide.
Really?
All throughout the county.
Okay.
And again, that was a new effort too. We're trying. So we're hearing folks saying, hey, we want to be engaged more. So we really are trying just throughout all of our practices.
This is amazing, but
Thank you. Yes.
I just, Christina Bosworth. If you say in there a social media post, but I think you reach more people if you put social media posts, because I know I see things from the county on Facebook, and I also see them on Nextdoor. And I know they're in my community, which is older community, it's an over 55 community. Many people don't use Facebook, they only look at Nextdoor. So having multiple posts, you reach a broader audience. But the main thing I want to say, and it doesn't have anything to do with the action today, I do support it. People don't know what TIP amendments are. And people are going to drive by those signs all day and not have any idea what it means and see the posts. I think, from a personal perspective, I had no clue what a TIP amendment was before I joined this committee. And I think the general population of Hillsborough County doesn't understand what it is and what it means to them and their neighborhood. So I think, I like this action. I'm going to support it, but I think we really need to look at a little better education.
You are absolutely right. But you're absolutely right. So we are actually, I'm working with Johnny and his team. We're going to start putting out a series of social media posts, mini videos to try to educate people on the TIP amendments as well, because what is the TIP? And again, it comes up once a year, and we feel like, okay, this needs to be something that's in people's ears and in their minds throughout the year, so that way we can better garner some feedback. So yeah, we're with you. You'll start to see some stuff coming out. And we do have a Nextdoor account. Nextdoor is really finicky about sponsored ads, and we're a huge agency, so hopefully we can get a couple of things on Nextdoor this year as we're splitting it with the other departments. So, but thank you. We're definitely on that.
Josh Frank.
Yeah, I have a couple points. One is similar to what was mentioned. I think in general, TIP, Transportation Improvement Plan, TIP amendments, like the terminology of the TIP itself at a broad picture is pretty wonky, and again, not very digestible for the average person. That sign has got a lot of text on it, for example, right? If somebody driving past at 45 miles an hour isn't going to be able to read every word on that. In fact, we probably don't want them reading every word on that. So I think the branding of the TIP, more or less, needs to be simplified and given something that's a little bit more accessible for people. I don't know what that means, if it's a new term or something to just catch people's eye that's a little bit bigger picture and broader. Again, I think having all that information is great, but I think the road signs are a bit cumbersome for people, just purely based on the amount of text that's on them. So take off my graphic design hat and put back on my CSE hat. There's a couple things technically in here that I'm a little concerned about. One is the TIP amendments are generally considered at public meetings. I'm a little leery that gives an opening for a scenario where a TIP amendment is never heard at a public hearing, because the word generally is in that statement. So, that is, this will probably be no surprise to anybody, but one of the things that frustrates me a lot with the TIP process is the sort of October surprise where we get a TIP amendment last minute that nobody's ever heard of, that we don't even know anything about. And so, we're the sort of maybe first backstop for a lot of these things as they come. And so for it to say generally considered concerns me a little bit, because that means we may never get a chance to see it. And that may be wrong, but that's just my impression with that verbiage. And then the last one I have is, again, really technical and wonky and probably not necessary, but in the other slide about advertisement, you say that the Tampa Bay Times and the TBT. I don't think the TBT exists anymore. So that may need to be removed from the language.
No, it does.
Does it?
It does. I'm not sure. I have to check for hard print, but tbt.com is still.
Okay.
Viable.
Well, in as a newspaper of general circulation, I don't think the asterisk TBT is published anymore in print. So that may be, again, is a little technical detail, but when we're thinking of accessibility in terms of folks who don't have internet access, or need to see something in physical format, or even ADA required, access to documents. That maybe is a bit incongruent with that as well. So I would just encourage that level of thinking for advertisement in general, right? Folks who don't have internet or have a visual impairment that can't read something that is, in the TVT or Tampa Bay Times or unplannedosworld.org, or they're not even subscribing to the newsletter. There's got to be a way for those folks to be able to access that as well, and I'd like to see that reflected in the language.
Okay, thank you. So may I just respond to, I'm sorry, sir. So what I got from that is, yes, look at the wording, because generally it does not accurately reflect what we're trying to do here, which is that tip amendments are going before the board for consideration, not generally. So definitely I'll take a look at that. The road signs actually have improved. So since then, we've tried to make it more colorful. I don't have an example now, but you are right that definitely it gets a bit wordy. We do put them at places where traffic stops, and Johnny's team has gotten calls from some of them. We have put now a QR code on there, so it's evolving, but I'm definitely going to take a look now at, I respect your marketing hat as a fellow marketer, so I'm definitely going to look at these public road signs, which are basically, it's government. That's what we've been doing, but maybe we haven't been doing it that well. So we recognize that. So I'll see how we can take some of the wording off of that. And then, yeah, I'm going to dig into that TBT. Maybe replace with creative voting, and try to see how we can navigate around folks who may not be able to read a paper. So that's why we started looking at mailers. But then again, you're right. If someone has a visual impairment, then how do we conquer that? So I do have those three things right up here that we'll address. Thank you.
Judge Fernandez.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Davina. First of all, to disprove any opinions that some may have that I'm always negative about everything in this room, I want to acknowledge that I do believe you've made an effort, the team has made an effort to respond to some of the concerns that my community, I have expressed in this room and before the board. I come from a lived experience over the course of the last year, whereby I have concluded that the public participation process completely failed Tampa Heights and the urban core as regards the downtown interchange and its expansion. I'm on record for that. We don't need to go back into it again. And I think you're making an effort to try to address those concerns. So I want to appreciate that in public, that you're hearing us.
Thank you, sir.
Whether it's gone far enough or not, that's another issue. At this point, I'm just happy with incremental change and in the right direction, which I think you're trying to make here. That said, let's talk for just a moment about a term that we've all become intimately familiar with, that is point of no return. We've been talking about it now for months. I don't know who barely understands it yet, but we've been talking about it. I believe that it's important that somehow it be communicated to the public. And I'm not talking about a sign that's going to be on a street corner, because who the hell is going to read it? Who's going to understand it if you said it? But somewhere, somehow, in the process of communicating to the public, the coming of tip amendments, whether it's a week from now, 2 weeks from now, a month from now, that people need to be advised through your process that there is a point of no return issue regarding this tip amendment. And, warning Will Robinson, if you get beyond this point, you're going to be lost. Or at least somebody's going to be arguing that you're lost. And I don't see any reference to any of that in any of your materials that you brought forward. Now, do I think that's going to be effectively communicated in a mailer or roadside? No. I think it's something that needs to be effectively communicated in your notice to the public, to civic associations, to committees, because we ultimately have the megaphone, and one of our responsibilities is to communicate what we know to our constituents. But we can't do it if we don't know about it. Point of fact, since it's within your study period, October 2021, 14 tip amendments are brought by the DOT or requested. I don't know if all of them were DOT requested. 14 tip amendments were considered. They were considered by this committee during a CAC meeting where we had no quorum. couldn't take any action on them. There was a lot of discussion about it, but no action. It was then brought before the board a week later, October 13th of 2021, a day that will live in infamy for me. And the TPO board approved all 14 of those amendments. 2 of those amendments involved lane movements in the DTI that would expand the downtown interchange and move walls in my neighborhood. What we now know, because the DOT finally gave me the information about a month ago, is that they considered that vote in October of 2021, the vote authorizing the use of funding for the downtown interchange and for those lane movements. They considered that vote in October of 2021 as being the trigger point for the point of no return. Design phase started way back in September when the SCIS record of decision was entered of 2020, February of 2020. But from that point until October of 2021, we still could have done something according to their reading of the rule. But by the time that funding came down from Tallahassee and was presented to the board in October, and the board said, yeah, you can use that money for the DTI, at that point, the project was funded for construction, and that was the point of no return. And again, by their argument, hands were tied after that. Agree with it, but that's the point. I didn't have any freaking clue about that in October of 2021. It wasn't presented here as an issue. It certainly wasn't presented in any notices. And I can assure you there's no member of the TPO board that knew it. They weren't aware. I've asked them. I don't think they'd admit it, but they didn't know. So that was a critical point for us. And a lot of damage is being done as a result, and people didn't have a chance to be heard. That TPO board meeting on October 13th of 2021 was very poorly attended. I was there. I made my arguments, but compared to what we used to see where people would hang out till 2 o'clock in the morning, not even close, and of course it was virtual for the most part, which is another problem. So anyway, long-winded story, but the public participation plan failed. It failed because communication was not in any way effective. And people that should have known and would have cared sitting in this room were not aware. So, tell me about somebody that lives over at the corner of Central and 7th Avenue who really never ever thinks about this stuff, how he or she would know that the wall right down the block is about to move 50 feet closer to their house. And would they have cared? I suspect so. So that's a big crack in this, and a lot of things can fall through it. But we really need to beef that up. I don't know if there's a way you can do that between now and the board meeting, but somewhere in all of this, there needs to be recognition of that timeline. So anyway, thank you. Sorry it was so long-winded, but I do think it's important. It's not a policy issue for me. It's very personal.
Well, I thank you for that, Mr. Fernandez, and yes, it is very important. And I will get with Johnny after this meeting to see how we can put some type of wording or practice. I know he's already worked, or you've already worked on amending the tip of the program and how we are grading stuff and addressing that, but I can see how we can relate that also to the public participation plan. Because you're right. So if that's something that needs to be out there in the public, which it does need to be out there, then we'll make sure that it gets out there.
Thank you, Davina. Other questions? Second. Any question from any committee members online? Josh Frank.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think it has to be just this and nor incredibly complicated, but it could be as simple as saying projects are green, projects are red. If it's green, it's before the point of no return. If they're red, it's past the point of no return. And, use that with the signage, use that with the branding. Again, this isn't the only solution. There are a lot of flaws, as Rick pointed out, for projects that perhaps don't have any action and then get to the board and they're already brought to the board and past the point of no return because they're a design build or, some other project that's been designed already. So, I think there's a lot of flaws still, but I would encourage the TPO and staff to think about this as, again, through that broad lens of that's an education issue, and it's a branding and marketing issue in addition to process and procedure and all that. So
Thank you, and I would love to run some ideas if I can. So, figure it out. Thank
Any
you.
other questions from the committee? I just want to make a couple of observations. Vita, thank you for coming in and making these improvements. I would suggest that in addition to notifying the public, that you try to reach out to the homeowners associations of any affected areas and get in their newsletters, if you have time to put that information out. Some communities have newsletters, some have online newsletters. They all do it differently, but they are a source of information for the public. I would also ask that this CAC be included in each and every communication regarding TIP amendments as soon as it's available. Because to Mr. Fernandez's point, when 14 or 5 or even one amendment come to this committee without any sufficient time to prepare, it is difficult to make a decision and move it on to the TPO board. And then finally, I would echo Mr. Frank's comments. Let's keep working on the branding. It's getting better. The signage is better. My acid test for signage about transportation issues is my wife. And when you pull up to a stoplight or a stop sign, there's a sign there, Johnny knows this, and there are 21 lines of information on there, and that stoplight lasts 30 seconds. We don't read it. And sometimes she takes a picture, but I will assure you that my acid test is that she does not comprehend what that sign says. So keep working on it. You're getting better. This is the #1 issue for the public in Hillsborough County. Transportation comes up in almost every civic conversation I have, and I suspect that's true for these other committee members. So I'm going to vote in favor of the amendments. I'm going to encourage you, Johnny, to keep working on them because these amendments do affect people's lives, and they are concerned about it if they know it. With that, I will close my comments and
Thank you, Chair.
see if there is a motion. This is an action item. We're being asked to approve these recommendations, recommend them to the TPO board. Is there a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the amendments.
Christina Bosworth makes a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ed Drusky seconded. Any further discussion? Any committee members online have comments?
Everybody does have the ability to unmute themselves if they would like.
Thank you. All right, hearing none, I think let's just call the roll. Gail, if you call the roll, we'll take a roll call vote on the motion.
Bill Roberts,
Yes.
Rick Fernandez,
Yes.
Carolyn Brown,
Yes.
Hoyt Prindle,
Yes.
Christina Bosworth,
Yes.
Miaza Morrison,
Yes.
Artie Fryer,
Yes.
Don Skelton,
Yes.
Ed Mrzewski,
Yes.
and Joshua Frank.
Yes.
The motion passes 10-0.
All right, Anita, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, committee. The next item, we'll move into our status reports. And Loretta Kirk is going to give us an update on the HART fiscal year 2023 budget. I know Loretta was.
Good morning. Good morning. Would it be easier for you to show the slides? And I just walk through the slides, whatever's easiest for you.
Gail should be pulling those up for you.
I think.
I have it ready.
Yeah, and I'll just tell you into advance, and that way we won't have any technical difficulty.
Mike, if you're there, can you please give me the presenter? Thank you. Which screen are you seeing?
This is your teams.
My teams. Okay. How about now?
I see the presentation. If you can just make it into a slideshow, I appreciate it.
You betcha. Ah,
Just come to
All the way left.
right here.
yeah, from the beginning. There you go.
Can you still see it?
This is the notes view.
Okay, hang on. I see everybody else have these challenges, but I don't share too often, so.
Display settings on the left, top left, display settings. You can swap, present your view. Up at the top,
Yep,
just drop down. It says display settings.
on sharing. Mike, can you come help me?
Loretta, we appreciate your patience. We're almost there.
That's okay. That's all right. This whole week has been a challenge, so it's no problem. But I would say that is not okay. Okay, I think we have it. Are we okay?
I sure hope so. I'm gonna give it a try.
Okay, good morning again. And this is really a status report. Of course, no action is taken at this committee meeting. This is an update on the budget. This presentation is really the operating budget. We had developed a draft 5-year plan and developed a fiscal year 23 capital budget. But the updates to that go to the board on the 15th, the HART board on the 15th. And after that, I'll be prepared to share that with you if you so choose. I know we were scheduled last month to go through the entire budget process, the entire operating budget, but this is only the, like I said, updates to the operating budget, if that's okay. So, as I stated, the budget is still under development. The HART board is still deliberating on the budget. And as I stated, on the 15th, we'll talk about the capital plan. So if we just go to the next slide. So today, I just want to go over the remaining budget development calendar. We started this process in May. And then I'll talk about the updates to the proposed operating budget in terms of the service that we're going to provide for fiscal year 23, our revenue assumptions, expense assumptions, and then we'll look at the summary of the operating budget. In terms of the calendar, as I stated on Monday, the board discussed this presentation that I'm giving to you today. We discussed the service plan as well as the operating budget. On the 15th, we'll talk about in detail the 5-year capital plan and the fiscal year 23 capital budget. And feel free to, view that presentation on YouTube. Then in September, we have the 2 required public hearings. The first public hearing on September 12th will be to adopt the tentative millage rate and the tentative budget. And then the public hearing on September 26th, hopefully the board will adopt the final millage rate and the final budget. And I'm sure that everyone in the room knows that these public hearings have to be after 5 p.m. So both of them are scheduled for 5:30 p.m. at the HART facility on 7th Avenue. This is our proposed service for fiscal year 23. I have fixed route here, the paratransit and the streetcar. We have revenue miles, revenue hours, and ridership for each mode. If you look at the bottom where it says all HART, you can see that in terms of miles, 8.9 million, revenue hours, 704,000. And then ridership, you can see is steadily increasing since the beginning of COVID. And we're expecting to have almost 11.7 million rides for fiscal year 23. I'll just stay on this slide for a minute because there's so much information. Like I said, this is the revenue miles, hours, and ridership for each mode of transportation. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So in terms of ad valorem, which is our major source of revenue for the operating fund, we are projecting a 14.7% increase or $8.3 million increase. And of course, according to our board policy, we only budget 95% of the ad valorem, which gives us a little contingency, should expenses run a little higher than expected. COVID relief, right now we are drawing down on the American Rescue Plan Act funding, and we are expecting to use $20.6 million of that money to balance the fiscal year 23 budget. We did have CARES Act funding, we had CARISA Act funding, and now we're working on the ARP funding. We were awarded $47 million. We used $9.8 million for our amended budget for fiscal year 22. We're going to use this $20.6 million for fiscal year 23, and then we'll have $17 million remaining for future years. Our fares are budgeted based on our projected ridership. In terms of federal operating grants, we do have flexibility to use our 5307 grants for operations in terms of preventive maintenance or for capital. And we are expecting to use $4.4 million of the 18 million that we're expecting for operations. And then from the state, we're expecting to receive $9.4 million. We do expect the FDOT grants to continue for the streetcar free fares, and that's budgeted at $800,000. In addition to that, I'm sure you all know that the city of Tampa balances the streetcar budget with any shortfall of revenues, and that's projected at $742,000. And then we get additional funding from the city of Tampa for the streetcar operations, and that will be $1.3 million. And then our other income is $946,000. In terms of expenses, the salary and wages include the impact of a recently negotiated labor agreements. We, for the Teamsters and the ATU, we negotiated new labor agreements. Healthcare, I think everyone is experiencing increases in healthcare. That's projected to increase by 10%. And then our fuel cost projections are very important because everyone knows that fuel has raised over prior years. For CNG, we're projecting to expenses at $1.62 for the diesel gallon equivalent. Diesel fuel, we're budgeted at $4.50 a gallon, and unleaded fuel, we're budgeting at $3.40 a gallon. So considering those assumptions for revenue and expenses, this is our revenue budget. And of course, our revenues and expenses have to equal. So this is a balanced budget. We are expecting to receive, based on those assumptions, $114,309,110 in revenues. And you can see the revenue components. The ad valorem, as I mentioned, the ad valorem transfers to capital is the money that we use from ad valorem to pay for capital projects that may not be funded or that are not funded through our capital program and capital grants. And we're just budgeting 95 million. All of our capital projects to date, we've been able to match them with federal or state funding. I mentioned the ARP, American Rescue Plan. And you can just read down the list for the revenue assumptions or the revenue amounts for the $114 million. On the expense side, again, $114 million. You can see that the personnel costs consistent with prior years and certainly consistent with the transit industry. We're projecting our personnel costs, which includes fringe and healthcare, to be about 70% of the budget. And then you can see the other operating expenses for contract services, 8.9 million, parts and supplies, insurance costs, fuel and oil. You can see that significant increase, that 30% increase over last year because of the, obvious increases in the cost of fuel. Administrative, other expenses, contract expenses, legal, utilities, marketing and printing, and taxes and fees, again, for a total of $114 million, which is a 5% increase over the fiscal year 22 amended budget. So that's where we are with the operating budget. As I mentioned, the capital budget will be discussed in detail with the board on the 15th. But given what I provided today, I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you, Loretta. Appreciate it. Good summary. What Prindle has a question?
Well, can you just put the budget slide back up that you had the last one? Yeah, just leave it there for a second. I want to look at something else.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Questions? Ed?
Yeah, I wondered, this is very informative. I wonder, since the ARP funding is pretty significant, what's going to be the impact of not having that next year? And then another observation is we've got this really important referendum coming up in November. And
I can't hear you. I couldn't hear.
I'm sorry, we have this really important referendum coming up in November. And I think that there's a large part of that that's earmarked for transit. And I think it would be really, really helpful as it gets closer to that referendum if HART could come forward with some really serious suggestions about what are going to be the incremental improvements that those funds are going to be used for. I think that would be a huge selling tool. Just a observation that frankly isn't really related to your presentation.
Okay, and I appreciate that comment. We do have our marketing director, Kimberly. Kimberly, are you on? I think you're on the call, aren't you? And we will certainly share that with our CEO, Mr. Grant, your comment. I appreciate it.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions or comments? Anyone online have a question or a comment regarding the presentation? Gail, are there any hands raised?
I don't see any.
All right, Horton Prindle, you have a question?
Yes, and I apologize if I missed this point during the presentation. Two things. One, what is the driver of the taxes and fees going up so much as an expense? And two, can you explain kind of the variance in the operational contract services? I mean, it jumped pretty significantly from fiscal year 21 to 22, but now it's projected to go back down. I was hoping to just get an explanation on those two things.
Yeah, the contract services is really a balancing act, if you will. I think we have some expenses that we expected to incur that we're not going to incur, and so we budgeted it for them in fiscal year 23. But those are just the day-to-day contracts that we have in the operations. Whether it's for towing services or whatever we need to operate the system. And if you recall, well, you don't recall, but a lot of the contracts are multi-year. So you're not going to see a balance from year to year, because once we budget for them, we may have, depending on whether it's a milestone or we're paying up front. And that's just really just the ongoing services to operate the transit system that we contract out. We also have like paratransit, where we contract paratransit out to taxi services and just the day-to-day operational expenses.
Okay, and could you explain what the big increase, more than double since fiscal year 21, the taxes and fees are?
Now, the taxes and fees, you know what? I don't have that detail with me, but I'll be more than happy to send the chair an explanation, if that's okay.
Yes, that would be, thank you.
Okay, I'll get that detail. And should I send it to Mr. Wong? Who should I send it to?
Yeah, Loretta, you can send it to me and I'll circulate it to the committee.
Okay, okay. And I'll give you a little more detail on the operational contract services also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hoyt. I think there was a question raised by Ed Majerski earlier that you may not have heard, Loretta. And that question was, what impact do you think will be felt by HART if you do not have the federal funding available next year? Do you anticipate cuts in service or cuts in personnel, or I'm just throwing ideas?
The ARP funding.
ARP funding. Okay.
The ARP, now, you know, that's a very political question, but from a budgetary perspective, I will say that if go to revenue if you can. All right. Okay, I have a crazy system that goes idle if you don't use it. Okay, the revenue slide, the actual revenue slide with the dollar figures. Keep going. Okay. Okay, we do have, if you see the line item that says federal grants, and you see where it's 21 federal operating grants, we have a grant, which is 5307 money that is flexible. So we can use it for operations or we can use it for capital. Because we have the ARP money, we decide this year and in fiscal year 23 to use it for capital to catch up on some of that backlog, the midlife overhaul, to keep the buses in good repair. But you can see in fiscal year 21, we used $12 million of that money for operations. So that money increased with the new Jobs Act, the Federal Jobs Act, and we're getting I think $18 million, and we can use that for operations. But right now, because we have the ARP money, we decided to use it for capital. So that one grant, that's the 5307, federal FTA 5307 grant, gives us that flexibility to use it for operating. So if we needed more operating money, we could get it from the using the 5307. Of course, that's at the expense of the capital plan. And of course, we have $17 million of the ARP money remaining for future years.
Okay. Other questions from the committee? Johnny, go ahead.
Can I respond to Ed? Ed, you asked a question about HART providing some projections for its layouts if they were to receive sales tax funding. I suspect the reason why they wouldn't proactively provide that info is there's a new state law that prevents government agencies from proactively providing info, and there's a long existing state law preventing us from lobbying for taxes. So we're now only allowed to provide information in a factual way if it's in response to a question that we receive.
But I mean, there must be like some plan somewhere about, you know, if we got this money, we'd have light rail transit and we'd have all this other stuff. Just, you know, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like getting that out to the public could be really helpful.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a scenario that they considered in the last TDP, but if it is, I'll get the info and some light.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. I will add that, you know, we want the public to know about HART and the service we provide and the cost of the service and the revenues we receive. So we do have an extensive public outreach program. In addition to, you know, talking to you and other committees of the TPO, we're actually taking our budget on the road, so to speak, and having some collateral material for the public, putting information on our website. I just met with marketing yesterday, and we're kicking that off as soon as we present the capital plan, because we don't want to put anything out that is not semi-final, if you will, that the board hasn't seen. But once they look at the capital plan again on the 15th, we're rolling out our public outreach for the budget.
That's good to know. And I think, picking up on what Johnny Wong just said, please consider this a request to come back to this committee in September, if possible, and give us whatever information is available on that plan as to how the sales tax funds might benefit HART. Rick Fernandez, did you have a question?
Well, yeah, for starters, Chair, you anticipated my request, so thank you for that. Just following up on Ed's comment, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that his inquiry was sufficient to satisfy the requirement that Johnny just shared with us. But on a broader scale, if in anticipation of whatever might be ramped up in terms of PR for the transportation surtax referendum between now and November, if a representative of HART were to be in front of my civic association, for instance, in September, October, and you were asked a question regarding the impacts of the AFT funds, are you all prepared to respond to that in some specific incremental way on your budget, or is that not available now?
I just want to remind everybody that it is not our sales tax. It's not our surtax.
I understand.
Tax. So that's a question that I have to pose to our CEO and our legal counsel.
Okay.
Whatever that means.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, it means what I just said. That's something that I can't respond to right now. And, you know, we have to be very careful from a public entity perspective. And so I'll refer that to my CEO and my legal counsel. That's exactly what I mean.
Okay, that'll be very helpful. Anything else from the committee? Well, Loretta, thank you for bringing this information to us. It's very helpful. We'll look forward to hopefully hearing something back in September about the plans for use of the sales tax and any information you want to provide on capital expenditures. So thank you.
Okay. Okay, and I suspect, Kimberly, I'll get that invitation through you or through someone to present.
You can coordinate anything you want with us through Dr. Wall.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Right.
We will, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Patience.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem like it. Seemed like a pretty benign question to me, but just get a legal opinion. Ed and I having a good day today.
What's that now?
We're having a good day today.
And we're agreeing on.
We've had meetings of minds since we had them. I think this deserves a glass of wine or something at lunch.
2-10-0 votes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, we haven't had many unanimous votes.
It's because we're in the twilight zone.
Because all the naysayers didn't show up today.
All right, Everton, Johnny, you're up. The next item on the agenda is the CAC organizational structure. I'm waiting with bated breath.
All right, so thank you, CAC and Johnny Wong TPO staff, and today I'm here to present to you some proposals that staff brainstormed internally for some potential changes to the structure and membership of the CAC. We actually presented this last month to the CAC, but because it wasn't a mandatory meeting, we weren't asking for anyone to take action. In fact, where we left the discussion was we quickly briefed you on some of the ideas that we have for changes that we think might allow us to have better demographic and geographical representation, as well as presenting a diversity of perspectives countywide. So we presented those ideas to you all and asked you to sit on them for about a month, take some time and think them through, and then return to this meeting with your own ideas or a reaction to the ideas that we presented. I'll quickly go through some of the slides that I presented last month, just to establish a little bit of context to why we're proposing these changes. So you may remember that a year or more ago, we asked you all to review the non-discrimination and equity plan. And of that plan, there were a number of recommendations that pertain to committee membership and committee structure. We feel that we and the plan and the committees that approved it and the board believe that increasing accessibility to meetings would be a positive for public engagement and, again, capturing those diversity of perspectives, meeting people where they are, evaluating the need to improve representation on our committees. Some of the specific tasks that were presented to us were to consider the addition of some seats on committees. CAC has a number of seats reserved for demographic groups. We have a seat for those 30 and younger, African American, Hispanic, transportation disadvantaged, but we could consider adding some new seats to make sure that we're capturing all of the demographic groups that are underrepresented on our committees. We may also consider removing some seats and removing barriers to membership. So that is the statement of purpose, why we're proposing these changes to you all. If you look at the roster of CAC membership over time, we have never really come close to approximating the demographic breakdown countywide. So countywide, about half the population is female. I don't think that we've ever come close to representing that on the CAC. 13% of the community is between the ages of 18 to 25. We do have one seat reserved for folks who are 30 and under, but I don't believe that we've ever had a teenager serving on the CAC, and certainly not many. 61,000 is the median household income countywide. We don't implore you to give us those details, but my suspicion is because of the folks who are able to set aside some time to participate in this meeting, we're probably not coming close to hitting the mark for household income either. Some months back, we circulated a survey to you all asking for your ideas on what you liked about the CAC, what was working well, what was not working. We also circulated a survey to the larger county, and last month I briefly recapped some of the survey responses. I won't go into the detail of all the responses that we got. I believe we asked about 7 questions. For 2 of them at least, the responses were somewhat split between neutrality and agreement. I only provided the responses to or only recapped the survey questions that had an overwhelming consensus on this slide. So among the 7 questions, there was an overwhelming consensus that an evening start time would be better to encourage folks to meet after normal business hours when people are not occupied doing their job. That would probably be good for encouraging better participation. There was strong support for a hybrid meeting format, and at least at the staff level, we feel that this has been working well and giving you all some options and opportunities to participate where you might not otherwise be able to attend. There was a lot of support for more geographical representation, and there was a lot of support for additional demographic representation. Term limits was close to achieving consensus, but it was another one of those that was kind of evenly split. There were a lot of folks who didn't have an opinion one way or either. Like I would say about 30% of the responses were neutral, and a strong or a large number of the respondents believe that term limits were a good thing. Some of the proposals that we shared with you last month to address some of those issues that were identified through this survey process. Staff proposed beginning CAC meetings at 5 p.m. I think that when I proposed that last month, there was a response that 6 p.m. or even later than 5 would be ideal. So some members stated 6. There may have been some chatter among the other committee members who were in attendance. I don't really have a strong indication of what would be the ideal start time for you all or for the new members that we may recruit. But I think the conversation needs to begin with how do we balance the start time with the time to adjourn. This committee has often gone over time, and we don't want to abbreviate the conversation because for the most part, it's been really strong, robust, important convo. But keep it in mind that if we start at 6, there's the potential that we could get out at 9, 10, 11, and that presents a challenge for those with kids or those who work really early in the morning. The hybrid meeting format, again, that was one that people were generally supportive of. A lot of people like the ability to participate in person and virtually. At the same time, there have been a number of critiques about the way that the current hybrid format is being delivered to you all. We definitely understand that this is not perfect. I don't think that there is a perfect off-the-shelf tool that will treat people who are attending virtually in the same way that we treat those who are in person. You'll notice that those with the loudest voices are often those who are in the room. And, there's not really all that much that we can do about that with our limited technology, but we're willing to explore some options. Folks have commented somewhat frequently that it's difficult to raise their hand. If they're recognized, that's typically after those who are attending in person. We've had a number of technical difficulties. Just yesterday, in fact, our technical advisory committee meeting was shut down because the computer froze up and they had to delay some presentations. We've had a number today, but we have an amazing tech team that's willing to explore solutions and make improvements. We're actually pretty fortunate that we have a member of our support staff in this room with us, but we'd like to ask a little bit more formally than you all just letting me know in a side conversation, what are some of the issues that you've encountered so that we can create a list, turn that into an inventory, and start working on solutions for these minor issues that come up. Geographical representation, of course, had like a tremendous amount of support. The public survey that we circulated and collected responses for was overwhelmingly positive that there should be greater geographical representation. Some of the areas around the county that are underrepresented are Town and Country. Brandon has very few representatives. Apollo Beach, much of East Tampa is heavily populated but not well represented on this committee. So one of the ideas that we proposed to you all was to keep the existing seats. The way that geography is represented on the committee currently is by elected officials. So they tend to select folks who are from their district. And we're not proposing eliminating those seats. We'd like to keep that. But we think by adding seats, we might just encourage that much more representation of currently underrepresented areas. We proposed possibly 30 seats and reserving those for different parts of the county. There are currently 11 seats reserved for elected officials. Maybe a good place to start the conversation is 30 too many or not enough?
I'm sorry, you're talking about 30 total or 30?
30 seats on the committee just for geographic areas.
So in addition to what we now have, 30 more?
19 more. That's 11 of them are currently reserved for geographic areas. So that would be a total of 30. The two maps that I'm showing now, the one on the left indicates population around the county. On the right, it shows the home address for the committee members currently. So you can kind of see that there's, as I mentioned, there's not too much representation in the Town and Country area. Dana Shores, Brandon is severely underrepresented. East and West Tampa are kind of underrepresented. And going as far south as Apollo Beach. Demographic representation was one of the main reasons, or what was one of the questions that we were most interested in receiving feedback from. Currently, there are 5 seats reserved for demographic groups. There's an African American seat, Hispanic, transportation disadvantaged, women and youth. So the question we're proposing is, or not the question we're proposing adding 30 seats, not adding 30 seats, but a total of 30. So the 5 plus another 25 for a total of 30. Do you think that 30 reserved for demographic groups would be enough? Too many? mind you that this would be 30 in addition to the 30 reserved for geographic areas. To kind of dovetail with that, what demographic groups are currently missing? We only have 5 seats. Which seats should be reserved for different demographic groups? One way that we could maintain accountability with this, because we're going to have, if the committee grows, we're going to have a continuous treadmill of folks joining and leaving. So maybe the best way to ensure accountability and keep track of this is with an annual review of representation. At the beginning of every year, we review seats that have been vacated. We review membership, attendance. Maybe it makes sense to do a review of representational adequacy. That would help us target our outreach so that if we are deficient in members, we know what part of the county we need to target outreach to try to recruit new candidates to fill those seats. And then lastly, term limits. This was one of the questions that was kind of split between neutral and supportive. Some of the critiques that I heard from the last meeting from you all was that it takes about a year to get acquainted with TPO processes and businesses and our business practices. Many of you have an interest in transportation, but maybe don't feel confident enough to weigh in on some of the important plans, which we're seeking your feedback. So I would ask, if we were to keep the term limits as they exist now, would an enhanced onboarding process help? Maybe we can reduce that time frame from a year to get acquainted to 3 months, 4 months. If I spent more than an hour with you one time, maybe if I spent several days with you and turned it into a little bit of a workshop, might that assist? And then another question about how can we facilitate ongoing recruitment to fill positions as they open up? If we're going to establish a term limit, that would only facilitate more turnover. And how are we going to target our outreach so that we make sure we have people filling those seats and not just sitting vacant for a long time? All right, so I've talked enough. Now is the point where I'm going to turn it over to you all, and I'm really seeking your reactions. So please let me know exactly what's on your mind. I'm happy to hear the proposals. I want to end with just some bullet points to help guide the conversation a little bit. So specifically, we're asking your thoughts on these 5 issues. I'll leave this up here for you. If anyone has a proposal that they don't feel confident in sharing with the committee right now, you can always email me privately. So I'll open it up to you all.
Good report. Don, go ahead.
Okay, so I got a few things with this. First off, I'll go down this bullet point list. The evening start time, so I know we said one thing is accessibility, but if you want to target the lower income demographic, what about those odd working hours? Because they don't necessarily work 8 to 5. So that might not be a good thing. You might have to do start times based on who's sitting on the committee at that time. The hybrid meetings, I mean, that's fine. It is a convenient option. It just shouldn't be to the point where everyone's only being online. I think it is important to actually be here in person. So the representation, is it more important that demographics are represented or that people are participating? Because we already have a lot of seats, but right now, look who's in here today. We barely have enough to actually vote. That kind of goes into the term limits. I feel like that side of the table is fairly new. Maybe Hoyt's been here a little while. This side, we've been here a while. This is my 2-year mark. What happens if we term limit out? Are you going to be able to find people to actually come here and have a quorum? It seems like we're going to sacrifice quality for quantity. That's just my thoughts.
One way to overcome that is we would suggest, regardless of the number of seats we add, if any, would be to keep the quorum requirement low, 7, so that we have an even greater chance of maintaining a quorum with 60 people on.
Okay, Josh, did you have?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I'm tuning into a meeting in New York right now, so it's pretty on nose that we're talking about this. I think in terms of start time, I also serve on the CRA board for the YCDC, and our start times are at 3:30, and that actually works pretty well because it's a little bit of best of both worlds, right? From a professional standpoint, nobody schedules anything at the end of the day because nobody wants to, go past 5 or 5:30 on their workday in terms of meetings and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a natural way. People are ending their day anyway. And then from a community standpoint, it makes public comment a little easier, I think, too, because it's not first thing in the morning. You know, there may be different work hours, to Don's point. So I've found that out of all the boards that I sit on, that's sort of a sweet spot in terms of time and participation. You know, hybrid meetings, I think I'm gonna have the same comment for hybrid meetings and term limits and overall participation and absenteeism or truancy, however you want to phrase it, is I think there just needs to be more structure. I'm open to hybrid meetings insofar as I think it adds access for a younger demographic, perhaps, that is either working or, you know, working from home. I know I've benefited from it. And I would say, though, it's also open to abuse, where folks are only ever hybrid and we never have an in-person quorum, which is obviously an issue. So I think that may lend to having a certain amount that you could be hybrid, and it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. And the rest of the time you have to be in person. 3 strikes and you're out. And I think that needs to be enforced, both in terms of the staff, but also our elected officials need to be better with appointing people in a timely manner and staying engaged with whether or not their appointees are actually being present. So that's a bit of a challenge for staff, I know, but I think that's worth mentioning. And then last but not least, I think in terms of demographics, I think that map's really telling, and you're right, there is lack of representation from Town and Country and from Brandon, but geography doesn't vote. And I think it's actually pretty representational in terms of density. The Brandon aside, right? It makes more sense for somebody like me who lives in Seminole Heights and Rick who lives in Tampa Heights to be to have more folks in areas with more population, right? Because we're essentially representing a larger group of people. Having some folks out in Town and Country would be fantastic, but how many people are they representing? That is, I think, a true representative of how we should be thinking about it, in addition to you know, age, race, ethnicity, experience, background, all those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, you know, this is a board that oversees transportation, and the investment in transportation isn't equal across the county, right? The amount of money being spent in the city, in the urban core, is going to naturally be greater than the hinterland and the rural parts of the county. So that's not to say the impacts are equal or unequal. I think it's important to have those voices on the board, but in a way that it's distributed a lot like population. So I think that's one thing, in addition to geographic, you know, that to me, that's more important than making sure every corner of the county has a voice. And I think that helps solve a lot of the total number, right? It was a bit confusing. Is it 60 total? Is it 30 total? Like what the total number is? I think the more people you have, the more likely you are to have a quorum, perhaps. But the more people you have out in the edges of the county, the harder it is for them to get here. So, you know, I serve on T-BARTA, and we have this issue where it's a wide-ranging net, and it's hard for the folks that are in some of the furthest counties to get to Hillsborough County or Pinellas County on an even bi-monthly basis. So, you know, I would just encourage staff to think about those sorts of things. And then last but not least, term limits. And I don't mean to go on, but I think term limits are good and bad. I think they're bad in the way that you described them. It takes a lot of time to understand even what the TIP process is, and also get acquainted with the process. I think an onboarding or a boot camp or whatever, even if it's reoccurring for just the general population, not necessarily for people to come onto the board, would be useful to get people to know what the TIP is, to know what the process is. Mayor's, you know, office, they do a mayor's boot camp where people come in and learn about the city governance, right? I think that's a really great program. The TPO could look to do something similar if they don't already. But I think it would be useful to think of term limits, but maybe at a longer time frame, 5 to 6 years, something like that, just to make sure that we do get some new blood occasionally. So that's all I got.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Josh. You took the words right out of my mouth. We don't have any predetermined expectations for what the term limits could be, just floating the idea. It doesn't have to be 2 years, 3, 4, 5. whatever number you think will satisfy the needs of the committee. And Don, you raised a good point. One of the challenges for us is not recruiting members, but recruiting members who will show up consistently and have a perspective that they want to offer. So when we find good people, we definitely want to hang on to them. It makes our job as staff all that much easier. But we want to ensure that we're also seeking new perspectives. We don't want the committee to get stale. And I'm not trying to accuse anyone here, but I think the tendency is the longer you serve, the less diversity of opinions that we see, if that makes sense.
How do you improve?
We have the membership application form posted to the website. For seats that are at large, we just allow we allow members of the public to go fill that out. We keep that stored, and if we have a vacancy, we'll maybe take a look at the folks who have applied in the past 2 years or so. We'll reach out to them, ask them if they still have an interest and if they have availability. And at least in the past, we circulated a portfolio of their applications to you all and allow you to select who you want to be represented on the committee. For political appointees, we'll do roughly the same process, focusing in on applicants who live within that district, send to them and engage in a conversation. They might have other questions for us about what we see as the committee's need. We haven't had a need to do much targeted outreach lately because we have a long list of folks who are applying, seeking to serve on the committee. So if we need to fill a seat reserved for a demographic group, for example, it wouldn't be hard for us to find someone who's under 30 because we have a backlog of applicants.
Ed,
Yeah, just a few comments. I would say on the geographic representation, your presentation includes a dot map, a population dot map, side by side with current addresses. And I do think it would be really good if town and country was represented. It would be super good if East Tampa was represented. I mean, here you have a predominantly African-American community and nobody's represented from there. And then Brandon. I also think that, geez, adding 30 people, to me, I mean, that just starts to become a fairly unmanageable size. And if you did that, so then you've got 30 some members, and if you're going to do that, it seems like a quorum of 7 seems like not adequate. I don't know. I'm not that enthused about greatly enlarging the size. I just think it becomes pretty unmanageable, assuming that you have people who are going to show up.
What did you have?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So term limits in general, to me, on this committee and in politics, are one of the most overrated tools for governance of a board. I just think, people love to talk about them. It's good. It's simple, term limits, but what do they really accomplish? This is a volunteer board that there's no compensation from. I don't know that there's any added benefit other than, service to the community. So, if Rick Fernandez and Bill Roberts want to serve on this board for 20 years, why should we say no? These guys are actually engaged. They pay attention. They show up. I just think to put term limits on it for the sake of getting new blood is not the best way to go about it. At least in terms of political appointees, there's a natural term limit there because the politicians have term limits. And so, it's not like David Bailey. I don't know, who's gotten appointed in the same seat by multiple politicians. So I think given even now with some very dedicated and smart people, the lack of, attendance in person, I would just hesitate to put any kind of restriction that's only going to further have a brain drain from this board. For the hybrid meetings, I do think people need to make an effort to come in person. I am sensitive to the fact that, I live in Wellswood and I work downtown, so it's easier for me to get here than other people. I would even maybe consider in terms of an attendance requirement, where maybe the attendance requirement is different depending on how far your residence is from county center here. So if you live out in Waimama or something, maybe your attendance requirement is lower than, say, for Rick or Josh or I, who live 10 minutes from downtown. But I do agree with like Josh that people need to try to make an effort to come in person. The geographical representation doesn't bother me as much. I feel like, if somebody's interested in one of the communities and they want to participate, they have the ability to do so. And in terms of the evening start time, I'm totally for evening start time. All kinds of boards do it in the evening after work. Not everybody has the same work flexibility to, come down here in the middle of the day and have it not affect their schedule in negative ways. So that's what I got. Thanks.
Other Christina.
Yes, after you presented this last month, I went home and jotted down all my comments. So I'm not going to necessarily go through your bullet points as you have them there. The first thing is I do support term limits, even 2-year term limits, but here's something to consider. Could you consider allowing individuals to apply for a different seat when their term ends? For instance, at my 2-year term, I was appointed. Perhaps a different commissioner would reappoint me. I could qualify for, if you added an over 65 seat. I don't think we have one of those, but I think it's important to have an older population represented. I could qualify for a bicycle advocacy seat, a female seat, or something else. So there's that consideration. That way, we don't lose all of our experience, but we are bringing in new people with fresh ideas. And perhaps if I was sitting at a different seat, I might look at things through a different lens than perhaps the lens I'm looking at it now. So that's a possibility. As far as evening meetings, I prefer daytime meetings, but I'm retired. So I don't like driving after dark. And of course, where I live, there is no alternative to driving because HART doesn't go out there. So the other reason I prefer daytime is because I, like other people like Josh and others, I'm a member of other organizations that hold evening meetings. So it would be a balancing act. I may have to choose between this committee and other civic organizations. Also, the public hearings that many of us like to attend in the county are in the evenings as well. So we'd have to choose them between public hearings. But I would support holding evening meetings if we can attract more people and hopefully improve attendance. While it's not on your bullet point, we talked about it last month. I also think we can attract more members by holding meetings in other locations. If not every month, then perhaps quarterly. I think besides getting more members to attend, that would, I believe, promote more public participation. I've yet to see someone walk in this door from the public and speak. We've had some people call in, but I think if it were in other locations of the county, we might get more public participation. As far as adding many more seats, like the 30 and the 30 and that, I am strongly opposed to that. I think more than 25 participants in any meeting would likely be difficult to manage. And additionally, most of those people aren't going to participate. You're still going to get the few that are going to influence the output. You're still going to get only the few. So I think instead we should focus on having appropriate seats instead of more seats, and encouraging better attendance and participation by having hybrid meetings, evening meetings, and holding the meetings at different locations. I really like Josh's suggestion, I didn't think of this, and about having attendance requirements for hybrid. You can attend one hybrid meeting per quarter or something like that, but otherwise you have to be in person. Those are my thoughts.
All good thoughts. Rick Fernandez.
Thank you, Chair. No, I'm sorry.
That's all
I
right.
won't be too long, I don't think. Kind of
I
random.
don't know, maybe.
No, I'm not good. This is all kind of random, Johnny. You and I have had conversations about this, and I had an opportunity to discuss this with the committee last month. So this is revisit. Evening start time, I'm good anytime y'all want to start a meeting. I can be there because I too am retired, very flexible. The only recent experience I've had with evening start time might be somewhat relevant to this is the Independent Oversight Committee that you were liaison for those 2 years. Our meetings were, I think we started at 6 o'clock and we ran until 8 or 9 sometimes. Attendance was pretty solid, but that was kind of an unusual group and certainly not representative of the community writ large. But people got there and got there in numbers. The hybrid meetings, it's hard to argue with the convenience. I mean, yes, it's convenient, but it's also hard to argue that people that are there in a hybrid form as opposed to brick and mortar are not as engaged, are not as involved, often are not as informed. They just don't feel like they have an investment in what's going on in the room, I don't think. If we were to go to hybrid meetings, even with the current size, I still would like to see something that would impose a limitation on the voting rights. If you're going to vote, you be in the room. If you don't want to vote, you can be hybrid, you can comment, you can offer your opinions, become an advisor, if you will. But to vote, you need to be in the room. Help to create the quorum and be in the room to stand behind whatever your opinions are. Geographic representation and demographic. Frankly, I think the responsibility there is with the appointing authorities. I don't know how well you folks communicate to us. We're an appointed authority. We appoint at-large members. When we took the vote, I'm not picking on him, just what I can remember, the under 30 seat, Mr. Knudsen, who seldom appears, but nonetheless, he's our under 30 representative. When he was presented to us as an option and we voted him on, nobody discussed his geographic location or the demographic that he might represent. It wasn't part of it at all, other than under 30. Obviously, people under 30 fill other roles too. I'd be an African American under 30 who happens to speak Spanish. I mean, God, who knows? But we didn't think about any of those things. At least I didn't when we did the representation. And I don't know that the electeds or the agency appointing authorities think about those things either. So you might give them as a goal. Listen, you're due to replace Rick Fernandez. No, I'm a bad example because I'm at large. But you're due to replace Ed. When you replace Ed, think about these holes that we have in our demographics and see if you can help fill them. Something like that. Term limits, we already have them, and they're imposed in various ways, one with elected officials. We have people on this committee right now who are beyond their term limits and continue to serve at the will. So I don't know that we really need to be imposing new term limits on anyone. We can get people on and off of here very easily. Attendance, there should be attendance requirements. We have them, but we do not enforce them. We have people on our attendance roster now who have missed 3 or more meetings in a row. They're still on the roster. We have seats that are vacant and have been vacant for a long time, yet you say you have drawers full of applicants. Why aren't they already here? You can make numbers. We've got 20 or 21 or 22 seats. We got 7 people in the room and 10 in the meeting total. So a lot of the problems you want to solve, I think, are already solvable with the tools at hand. Making this committee a group of 30, I think, is a great way to make us totally ineffective, which may be some sub rosa goal behind the curtain because we are rowdy. And, it'd be nice to have us be bigger and less informed so we can be less rowdy and less efficient. And that's exactly what I think would happen if you had 30 people who show up helter-skelter whenever they feel like it, maybe not knowing what the hell they're talking about. So that's it.
Thank you, Rick. Don Scalp.
So I know y'all are going to depend on this survey. This is part of the recommendations. How many people responded to it?
I think I circulated that in after the previous meeting. I want to say about 55.
So we had 55 people answer this survey.
approximately.
How do those results look if you weigh the people who show up in person or show up at all more heavily? Because it doesn't make sense that you're going to listen to this person and this person who's never here on how we should run this committee, because they'll probably still not show up.
Oh, sorry, to clarify, we're not basing the proposals off of the results of the survey that we circulated to this committee. We use that as a guide to identify what was working well and what wasn't, whether or not we should even pursue changes to the committee structure. When we circulated the survey to the general public, like they're obviously not attending committee meetings, so we didn't base anything off of that, other than they gave us a really clear indication of whether or not they supported term limits, geographic diversity, demographic diversity, gave us ideas for how to structure the proposals. So we're not basing our recommendations strictly off of the survey. The ball is in the CAC's court. The information that we glean from the survey should inform your decision, but we are seeking approval from you all for any of these proposals.
Go ahead.
Just real quick, I have to go in 5 minutes, so to the extent we need to vote on anything, and then here to maintain quorum, I've got to get to a CLE. I just want to make the chair aware that maybe we could.
Thank you. Josh?
Just a quick idea. In addition to, the application process for folks to join the board that exists now, I wonder if it's at all beneficial for staff to follow up with people who show up for public comment and ask them after, a meeting or 2 or 3 where they're present to join. It seems that the folks who make the time and effort to show up and make public comment for this group, as little as it sometimes is, would make a natural pool of applicants that are either extremely passionate about the subject and knowledgeable to start, or at least informed enough of the process to get a head start in joining. I think that might be another just beneficial way of thinking about things. Thanks.
So, and Brett?
Yeah, I'm going to just counter one of the things that Christine said. I'm not in favor of moving it around. I mean, I think, for one thing, where we're located is pretty central to the whole county, relatively central. And if anybody were coming by transit, which probably they're not right now, this would be the most accessible place by transit. And in addition, I mean, let's say next month we met in Wamama. I don't know if I said that right. Wamama. Okay. But, so everybody's trekking to, the far southern end of the county. And then next month we're going to go up to Cheval for whoever lives up there. To me, that seems like it benefits one person a great deal for one meeting. And other than that, anyway.
Thanks. Yeah, this, in addition to this being our office space, this is the most accessible location by transit, so that definitely plays a role in the decision making about where to locate it. That being said, nothing's off the table. We have explored ideas to move or hold special meetings in locations around the county. It presents a lot of logistical challenges, as you might imagine, technical and otherwise, but it's not off the table. And a field trip is not out of the question, or something to that effect.
Just in lieu of, sort of adopting any of these or ad hoc right now, knowing that Mr. Brindle has to leave, I'd like to see staff put together like 5 recommendations to start and bring to us next meeting for approval or partial approval, and just get the ball rolling that way. We can always come back and add more or adjust them after discussing them. But I think this conversation has been helpful, but I think we're not ready to start adding stuff at this moment. At least it doesn't seem that way. It might be more useful. It seems like there's enough interest, and perhaps other board members may be present to help us next time with, starting with a few at least, and then moving from there. This could be something we talk to frequently.
Thanks for that. Yeah, there is a sense of urgency to wrap this up because, as stated, there's some vacancies. Happy to announce that I believe Councilwoman Hurtak is going to appoint someone soon. We've already had conversations about the vacancy, and her staff requested some applicants, and we chatted about what the committee needs are. So I have a feeling that appointment's coming up any day now. Great.
Good report, Johnny. I have comments on all 5, but I think I'll send them to you. But let me make a couple of comments. With regard to size of the committee, I think the committee should be no bigger than 30 in total. Hear what Rick says about getting too large. In order to encourage attendance, I would set the quorum level at 40% of whatever the membership is, in order to encourage people to be in the room. I think hybrid meetings encourage participation. They are technically difficult, and I think we should be open to the idea of having hybrid attendees vote under some circumstances, but not necessarily on all issues. I'm not sure how you do that, but I think we need to figure out a way to make this hybrid meeting concept work, because it does encourage participation. But I think the ultimate goal is to get the majority of the people who really want to participate into the room. That's the 7 of us have done. So I'll send you the list. This has been good. I think this has been a great discussion. I'm glad you brought it forward last month, even though it kind of caught a few of us by surprise. But I think now we've gotten into the swing of it. We've started thinking about it, and I appreciate you doing it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Let's move on to unfinished business. Or if you could bear with us a minute, I'm going to skip down to the new item C, under unfinished business. We have a request to explore a motion to reconsider. Johnny, are you going to present this or someone else?
I'd be happy to turn it over to Vice Chair Fernandez.
You want to be recognized?
Well, I can comment on it for sure. I appreciate that courtesy. And boy, I understand CLE is CLE. I'm not going to be making any motions that require action. So as far as the forum goes, just when you leave, you leave. So don't worry about that. At least I'm not. Maybe somebody else has a motion. I really never made a.
We're not rushing.
No, I love having you.
No, I wouldn't normally be so strict, but as he knows, like, you have to attest that you were there.
Yeah, you got to be there and you got to sign in, and you got to take it to ride with the bar. I never really asked for a request. This is Johnny's interpretation of what I asked for, which doesn't really capture where I was going. So I'll say this. It was my intent, as stated in emails that I hope all of you received, at least 2 of them, right? It was my intent to make a motion to rescind the actions of this committee vis-a-vis 2 line items of the tip. At our last meeting, there was a motion made by Mr. Hollenkamp to approve the tip, including 2 line items that involve what we previously described as amendments 8 and 9 of the involving the downtown interchange. Those are the lane movements that affect the walls in Tampa Heights.
I believe the motion was to approve the tip in its entirety as presented.
His motion was, yes, it was, and it was approved. And my motion was to rescind, or what I would intend to make by way of a motion was a motion to rescind that action. However, to make a motion to rescind with a reasonable voting burden, there's a notice requirement, which I tried to satisfy with the emails. I don't feel comfortable that the emails satisfy it. I tried to get it onto the agenda. It didn't make it onto the agenda. So I'm not satisfied that under Robert's rules that I have satisfied the notice requirement to the committee. So what I am saying to you now is that at our next meeting, at least the next meeting where we actually have some bodies, I would intend to make that motion to rescind. There is also an alternative motion as a possibility, and that's a motion to renew the motions to strike. That doesn't have the same burden in terms of vote and notice. But neither of those motions, I think, is ripe for consideration now, especially if you're leaving, and I think we're going to have to talk about this more than the amount of time that you have. So out of courtesy for that. So that's what that was all about. If anybody has any questions about what's going on in the dark recesses of my brain about this, I'll be happy to answer it. But that's the reason. Chair, I appreciate you advancing the discussion to get to it earlier.
Sure. So I think what we're hearing is a request to put this item on the agenda for our next regular meeting.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So noted. I'm sure Johnny will do that. Okay.
Johnny, can you refresh our memory when that motion was passed? How many people voted? I mean, to me, this sounds a little like I didn't like that result, so let's vote again.
Which motion? The one in March or the one last month?
Are you talking about the motion to approve the TIP?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, if that was like, 15-2 or something, it's like, okay.
No, I can give you the numbers.
I don't know. I'm just wondering,
In March, we passed a motion to strike these line items from the previous TIP, and that vote was 10-8.
Okay.
And this, most recently, I made a motion to strike at the last meeting, June 1st. I made a motion to strike. That's the motion that's discussed in the minutes. That was recast as a motion to strike. I made a motion to strike those two line items. And that motion went to vote 5-5. So it failed because of the tie.
But originally, my recollection is it was, what was it, 10-8, I think you said?
In March.
Okay, and so we voted to strike those items.
We voted to, basically it's a recommendation to the TPO board to strike those items from the TIP. But it was last year's TIP.
But then it seemed like you wanted to have the chairman represent that to the committee, like to make sure they heard it. And I think that's what ended up in the 5-5 tie, was a motion to have the chair like bring it to their attention again, even though it was brought to their attention nothing too early.
Well, it was a motion stated as I stated it and restated it in the minutes and recast by the chair, and I appreciated his recasting as a motion to strike those two line items. Effectively, that was the motion. That was made on June the 1st. That motion went to a 5-5 tie. With, we had a rather diminished membership in attendance that day. So it's that motion to strike those two line items from the TIP that I would seek to renew.
But that was done in March, right?
The March we took the vote and it passed 10-8.
Right, to strike.
In June, to strike. In June, we basically took the vote again and it failed 5-5 because of the tie.
Well,
I don't think so.
I think correctly, we took a vote in March regarding the TIP for that year.
Correct.
In June, we were voting on a new TIP.
We were voting on a new TIP.
And we passed that TIP recommendation in its entirety. We did not specifically address 8 and 9.
Except in the motion that I made.
Other than the motion.
I made a motion, the motion failed, and then it went on for a final approval on Hollenkamp's motion.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think we approved, we moved to strike those.
And there are two different TIPs. If we did approve in March to strike it in the old TIP,
right?
But we did not agree with Rick's motion in June to strike it from the new TIP.
I must have misunderstood because I thought he was just wanting you to go back and repeat what we had done in March. So I must have misunderstood.
There was a lot of room for misunderstanding and confusion and all that, and I appreciate that. I'm not casting any aspersions on anyone. The fact is, we had what I viewed as inconsistent positions on those two lane movements, separated by 2 months, 3 months. And one reason for that, I thought, was because a lot of people who voted in March weren't even here in June. So anyway, that's the point. I just want to make it a matter of notice under Robert's rules that that's an issue, and hopefully it will get on the agenda and everybody will have proper notice. That's all.
And that, we don't know how the people who were not here would have voted.
No, of course not.
Took the vote and we were addressing the TIP amendment that was scheduled to be heard by the TPO in June of this year. Okay, we'll move on and we'll move back to, yes, John.
Was there a motion to request staff to do that, or
No, I'm just making a
conversation
request on
ended?
I made no,
Okay,
I made no motion, I'm just asking that item be on the agenda.
okay.
And we can put it on, there's 2 or 3 places here on the agenda where we can request things beyond future agendas, and that's what
It would be, I would note this as a matter of procedure. It'd be great to have that agenda earlier in the meeting so that there's actually some time to talk about it rather than it being squeezed into the last 15 minutes.
So our next, so our next meeting is September 7th. The next item on our agenda is to discuss, vote on any agenda items for future topics. I think we have one. Are there others? And we've also added a request earlier in our meeting to have some information received from HART regarding their proposed uses of funds should the sales tax referendum be adopted. Along those lines, I would like to ask if the committee would be willing to have a discussion at next month's meeting about whether or not we should take a position on the referendum and recommend it to the TPO and the sponsors of the referendum. I'm not asking for that decision now, but I would like to put that item on next month's agenda. We are a quasi-governmental body. There are some limitations on what we can do, but I think we're also a group of volunteers, and I'll ask Johnny to give us guidance as to whether or not we can actually take a position.
So far, I've counted 4 potential topics for the following month. Next month, you should expect another tip amendment coming forward, roll forward amendment to balance the budget, as well as several others. So I will capture these and add them to the survey instrument, circulate that to the committee. You all can vote up or down which presentations you'd like to see.
Do they have any point of no return issues with your new TIP amendment?
Roll forward amendment is, I would say, routine business. We do it every year. Our TIP runs through the end of county's fiscal year. The state operates on a different fiscal year. So projects that are currently underway are at risk of losing their funding from August through October unless we reconcile the budget with the roll forward amendment. Kind of like gives us the ability to request money, continuing to funneling the money toward projects that are already underway so that there's not a 3-month delay.
So the answer, no, there's no point of no return issue.
I'll have to look at that, but I don't.
Yeah, would you?
I think that's an item.
I would like to say, I would prefer not to say anything else.
Okay, well, somebody needs to say something before we're being asked to vote on the amendment. I understand. I mean, if there's any red herring out there, it's that.
These projects are already in the construction phase. So they're already being built.
Well, that's a clue.
Okay. Next item on our agenda is members' interests and future topic requests. Kind of a repeat of what we just had.
Just a quick follow-up on something I asked for in June's meeting. We discussed, and it was reflected in the minutes, Mr. Chairman, you speaking to the board about our almost unilateral stance in support of the restructuring of the TPO board. And that was in the minutes and was discussed as, bringing to the board if appropriate, I think was the resolution. So just looking to see if that has happened, and if not, what else would need to be done in order to make it appropriate. To reiterate, because that, just to summarize, this was one of the few things I think as a board we uniformly were in support of, almost uniformly, I should say, and with enough passion that in going to the full board seemed like it was really passed over very quickly, and I think it'd be worth discussing again, or at least reminding the board that they had something that actually had some cross-boundary support, and we're still waiting for action.
Okay. Is that something you want to discuss in the next meeting?
Sure, yeah, just to see, for one, I was looking to see a simple answer, has it been discussed yet in front of the board? And if not, I think it'd be worth talking about again next week.
It was included in my report, and the board did discuss it at their last meeting. I don't think there's been any resolution yet as to the restructuring of the TPO board. It's a work in progress, certainly appropriate for us to discuss it further.
Great, thank you.
Okay, anything else? Anyone online have anything if they want to comment on the members' interests or future topics? Good hands, Gail.
I don't see any, and everybody does have the ability to unmute.
Very good. Well, thank you all for attending in person. Thank you, those of you on the line, and we are now adjourned.
Oh, the time. Be good.
Yeah.
Right on it.